Hello everyone, it's Ben Shute here, and I thought today I might share a few thoughts about period string instruments, and especially some misconceptions surrounding them that can have ramifications for our performance practice. So by way of background, I grew up hearing the terms baroque violin and modern violin, and probably a lot of that was because the period instrument practice that I encountered growing up centered on the baroque period. But immediately when you have this duality of baroque and modern violins, the question is immediately, so how do they relate to each other? I mean, rhetorically, no one would actually think it's this simple, but, so what happened on January 1st, 1750? Did someone flip a switch and suddenly we went from the baroque violin to the modern violin? How does that relationship work? What sort of transition was there? So I hope to address some things like that from the perspective of common misconceptions. So I hope this will be helpful for all of us. One thing I should say in advance is that many of these misconceptions we'll talk about do have a grain of truth to them, which actually probably makes it all the more important to be able to distinguish between what is factual and what is a misconception. So let's dive straight in and start with the idea that what distinguishes a baroque violin from a modern violin is the construction of the body. So namely that the old Amati Steiner high arch design is characteristic of a baroque violin, whereas the somewhat later, turn of the 18th century and early 18th century designs of Stradivari and Guarneri del Gesù with flatter arching and whatnot is a characteristically modern design. The grain of truth in all of this is that the Steiner and Amati designs do work beautifully for baroque setups, while the Stradivari Guarneri designs, which do work for baroque setup, but they do work extremely well in modern setup too, and they are virtually unparalleled modern concert instruments. That said, it's really not correct to say that Amati Steiner is baroque and Stradivari Guarneri is modern, because all of them actually would have made their instruments in what we would call baroque setup. The issue between the two is not the structure of the body. The difference between baroque and modern design isn't so much the structure of the body, it's the angling of the neck of the violin downward that was done later in the 19th century to create more downward tension on the bridge, which required a thicker bass bar underneath the bridge to soup the instrument up for modern concert use. That's the difference. But from Andrea Amati, Guarneri through Guarneri del Gesù and later, people were actually making instruments in baroque setup, even though many of them, and particularly Stradivari and Guarneri, would work very well in the later modern setup. So to illustrate this is my modern violin, and it's an old Italian 1722, made as you'd expect at this time. Actually, it's modeled on even older violins than an older design than was common at the time. But it's got a very, very high arching. So this is from Bologna, a very, very high arching here. And if you see the line along the body of the instrument, the neck is much more angled downward, right? If this line were to stay straight, it would look a little bit more like this, whereas it's actually angled down, because this violin would have been made with a neck that was somewhat more parallel to the body, maybe not totally. That's a question of some debate, and I think it varied maker to maker, but generally it would have been flatter in relation to the body. But then in the 19th century was angled downward to modernize it, to put that increased tension on the bridge and have a souped up bass bar underneath. So this is basically a Steiner Amati type design that would have been made as a baroque violin that actually has subsequently been modernized. So my modern violin is what this stereotype would say is a baroque design, whereas my baroque violin, as I mentioned, is a replica of the 1741 Viotti Guarneri del Gesù, which would have been made in baroque setup. Also works, incredibly wonderfully as a modern violin. But what we've got on this is as close as we can tell what the original setup would have been like, a neck that is fairly flat in relation to the body, or fairly consistent with the angle of the body, so there's not too much downward tension. So there is actually less tension on the bridge than in modern setup, and accordingly a thinner bass bar underneath. So what I've got here is a baroque violin that is Guarneri del Gesù model, and a modern violin that is the old Amati Steiner type of model, in general terms. So we can see that those stereotypes don't really apply. So just to reiterate, what makes a baroque violin baroque as opposed to the modern violin is the lesser tension downward on the bridge, and some other features of setup too. You can see that on the baroque violin, the tailpiece will It'd be made of more lightweight material than on the modern violin, and some other factors along those lines. But it has much more to do with the setup of the instrument, how much tension is on the bridge, and the thickness of the bass bar, and the density of some of the accessories, than it does with the actual shape of the body of the instrument. Another feature of the Baroque violin is that it would have been strung with gut. Yes, some other materials like silk were used occasionally, but gut was the preferred material, and played with a convex bow. So we've talked about a first misconception regarding the structure of the violin as it relates to Baroque as opposed to modern. But both strings and bow, which have to do with Baroque usage, have their own misconceptions surrounding them. So let's start with the gut strings. One misconception, because of the term catgut, is that these are made from feline intestine, which is not true. They are intestine, but it's sheep or beef gut, not catgut. Catgut is just a term that refers to something else about the construction of the strings, but it doesn't refer to feline intestines. Another misconception about gut strings is that Baroque instruments are supposed to have extremely light tension, so very thin strings to create very light tension on the instrument. So that's actually not correct. The lesser tension from the neck here, right, not being angled downward, already lessens the tension on the instrument. But there's a general agreement among the sources I'm familiar with from the period that actually advocate robust stringing. I mean, Leopold Mozart, in the middle of the 18th century, instructs his students to use nice thick strings in order to get, I think his term is something along the lines of a robust masculine sound. And surviving evidences that we have from earlier periods indicate that actually the strings that would have been used throughout the Baroque period are actually considerably thicker than the thicknesses that I was taught to use when I first started the Baroque violin 15 or so, actually more like 20 years ago now. What I was taught is to have a very thin A and E string, and then actually a synthetic, a modern synthetic metal wound D and G string. That actually is not at all historical. A wound gut G string would have been historical, but not a wound D string. We'll get into all of that later, but that's just to say that a lot of what modern players sometimes, I think particularly in the United States, think of as ideal Baroque stringing, or at least did not too many years ago, is actually not too representative of actual historical stringing. So the thicknesses that I use, just to put it in specific terms, I use an E string that is 0.68 millimeters, an A string that is 0.88, D string 1.16, and then the general guideline for the G string is that you want it, a wound G string, you want to be about as thick as the A string. So that's actually considerably thicker than even some string makers, some gut string makers make, and I have to actually custom order these strings, but those are historical thicknesses. So I think that is one thing that will continue. That is one area in which, at least in the United States, historical performance practice can kind of catch up with what we now know, what scholarship knows about string thicknesses. So when you're stringing up a Baroque violin, you don't want it to be too thin. We want to have a nice substance to the sound. Okay, so those are some misconceptions about the gut strings. Let's talk about the Baroque bow. And this is something I hear quite a lot, is the assumption that the Baroque bow is curved outward like this to match the curvature of the bridge in order to be able to play sustained 3- and 4-note chords in something like solo Bach. And the grain of truth to that is that the Baroque bridge is slightly flatter than a modern bridge, and it does make going between strings, especially when you're playing chordal passages, it does facilitate that. However, it's not accurate to say that you would play 3 and 4 notes simultaneously, or even that you really could. So, I mean, if you have a chordal passage, something like the opening of the Bach Chaconne, so you see I'm trying to ring the sound, but I'm very definitely crossing across the strings, and there's almost like this kind of bowed strumming of the strings. I'm not, you just try as you might to sustain that sound, it's not going to succeed, and it's, stylistically, it's not desirable either. To put this in context, there was an experiment in the mid 20th century where people saw these baroque, and this one is an English model that is quite similar to the German bows that would have been used at the time. So people saw that German bows there was quite a good distance between the hair and the stick. And, it's reasonable to think, well, with the flatter bridge of the Baroque violin, that must be to enable you to play, to sustain those 3 and 4 note chords of solo Bach. But when you actually try it, as I just did, you can see it doesn't work. So I thought, well, this is a great example of circular logic. Well, since it's self-evident that that's what the bow was designed to do, maybe we just need to curve it a little bit more. So they extended the curvature, and then it still didn't, right? So anyway, by the time they developed a bow this was called the Vega Bach bow, that supposedly Bach bow, it has no precedent in historical sources. Maybe if I remember, I'll put a link down below the video so that you can see pictures and maybe hear some recordings if you're not familiar with it. But basically, you had this bow that extended all the way up and arced. It was this monstrosity of a thing. And then the end result is that you could wrap the hair around all 4 strings and just sustain 4 notes. But and again, there's no historical source for there's no historical evidence for anything like that. And aesthetically, the result is completely at odds with what we see in treatises and whatnot. So it's a fascinating exercise in a bit of circular logic, but it also illustrates that just without a doubt, this bow is not intended to sustain 3 or 4 note chords. What it is intended to do, and the reason artistically, aesthetically, for this kind of curvature in the bow is that what it does is it creates inequality. So whereas the modern bow, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, but the modern bow you can see has a lot of weight down here, and not quite as much, but still a good amount of weight up here, and a lot more weight than the Baroque bow that has this little small head. And even this Baroque bow has more weight has more of a head than some. Some taper to even less wood up here. But what the modern bow is designed to do, it's a bit like a suspension bridge where you have, pillar here, and then you have this suspension bridge design that distributes the weight throughout and transfers between these pillars. And the idea is that this enables you to sustain the sound from one end of the bow to the other, with the intent of being able to produce a very even bow stroke. And the point of the Baroque bow is to facilitate exactly the opposite, to facilitate a release within notes, to facilitate this kind of release, and also to facilitate a difference between the heavy down bows and the light up bows, because there's so little wood up here, right? So basically what that does is it has a built-in heavy, light, strong, weak inflection that gives you a template from which you can form basically syllables. You can make the music speak as though it had syllables, right? We have a lot of sources from the period that liken music to rhetoric. So, and that you have this kind of speaking quality. Not, not pushed and pulled back and forth with everything very, very even, but up and down where you have a real down, up, it's like almost like breathing in and out, right? This kind of duality in how you approach bow strokes that gives you a much wider template to make the music speak rhetorically. That's the real purpose of the Baroque bow design. Okay, so we've talked about some misconceptions of the build of the violin, of gut strings, of the bow. Let's get back to the violin and return to this idea of kind of the Baroque violin as opposed to the modern violin, because this is another. We'll explore this in both directions, misconceptions about the Baroque violin and then what that means for what a modern violin must be. So the Baroque violin, it is correct to talk about a certain paradigm of setup that we can call Baroque, right? So that this lesser tension and whatnot, gut strings, convex bow, that's generally what we mean by Baroque setup, and that is a legitimate umbrella term to use. Within that, though, there was considerable variety, so it would be a misconception to think that Baroque setup was one thing that was static all through the Baroque period and universal in all its particulars. So let's go back to the very beginning of the Baroque period, or even back to the origins of the violin, which were around that time, the late 16th century. The necks of the violins would have been a little bit shorter and on average possibly even less angled to create even less tension on the instrument. So the instruments would have been slightly lower tension even than they were later in the Baroque period. The tension between the four strings, among the four strings, actually would have been slightly differently distributed as well. A little bit less toward the E string and a little bit more balanced toward the lower end. Or another way of saying that is the more equal tension that you found in the early setup that actually made the instrument very, very mellow, a very beautiful consort instrument. People started increasing the tension toward the upper end as you got later into the Baroque period so that it could work more brilliantly as, say, a concerto solo instrument in a Vivaldi or Bach concerto. So the tension on the instrument would have been less in the early Baroque. The distribution of tension would have been different, a little bit less toward the upper end. Another important difference would have been the G string. So you see on the G string of this violin, I have, so all of these strings are gut, as is the G string in the middle, but the G string is wound with metal. And that was introduced in the middle of the 17th century. Caught on virtually immediately. Players found the sound much better. I mean, that's actually a word. I'm not trying to impose modern sensibilities. That was a word that you find people using at the time about the sound, because gut is so much less dense than metal that to get a gut string of the same mass, you actually need a much thicker string, right? So that very thick gut G string produces a hazy, gritty kind of sound under the bow. Now, in a big space at a distance, it does open up, and it doesn't sound nearly as hazy as it does under the ear. But under the ear, it's definitely got some haze and grit to it. Whereas when you can wind the string with metal, the much more dense material means that you need less of it. You can have a thinner string, which immediately allows the sound to be clearer and more focused under the ear. So by the early decades of the 18th century, it was universal. So I do have that wound gut G on this instrument, appropriate to the time that it's modeled on, 1741. But at the same time, we can recognize that is one thing that changed during the Baroque period, even while instruments could still be seen as under this umbrella of being in Baroque setup. The bow itself changed as well. So I showed you the bow that I use. This is mentioned an English-German design, but from the late first half of the 18th century. The bows in the early 17th century would have been considerably shorter, would have had considerably less wood up here, and would have had a fairly primitive clip-in frog mechanism where you loosen the tension on the bow just by detaching the frog, clip it back in, that tightens the bow, and it's a bow that has a lot more weight here than it does at that very tapered tip down here. And the short bow means that it's not, it would be much less comfortable to play, say, a Bach fugue on that. But what it does really well is the kind of rapid figuration that you find in the diminutions of Italian music, say in the late Renaissance, early Baroque. French bows are also another thing. There's some interesting video footage of Ensemble Correspondance on YouTube. I think it's widely available there, and you can see the players using French style instruments and bows at the time that were, of course, holding the instruments down here as they would have been, which is still another development during the Baroque. The transition from people holding the instruments, whether against the ribs or kind of on the pectoral muscle, in a kind of gradual migration higher up here. And then there are, different sources from the period that say, you shouldn't use your chin you can use it to, balance when needed. And some say, well, of course you have to, a few say, well, of course you have to use chin. And we should just take those not as, especially the ones that say to use a lot of chin. I think a lot of people are cautious to say, well, that's one person's view. But what we can say is that there was differing practice, but there is kind of a gradual migration of the instrument higher up toward the point where it's balancing on the collarbone, much like it would for decades to come. And of course to the modern day, even though now we often use a shoulder rest, but we'll get there a little bit later. So the bow is something too that has evolved considerably during the Baroque period. Okay, so that's a little bit of an overview of the misconception that the Baroque violin is a single static thing. really to play Monteverdi, the equipment that you would want to play Monteverdi in a historically informed style is quite different than what you would use to play, Bach or something. Even though there is this kind of overarching umbrella of Baroque setup. But now I'd like to shift and talk about the violin after the Baroque period, because this is also where this Baroque-modern distinction becomes a bit kind of a troublingly problematic. It's easy to think then, by that language, that at the end of the Baroque period, which we think of being about 1750, that Baroque setup, as we know it, stopped being used, and then so did then the modern violin start being used. And that's actually a misconception. The Baroque violin, what we'll call general Baroque setup, there's substantial continuity actually into the first half of the 19th century. Yeah, there were some differences that happened in how the bridge was cut a little bit. It was still more similar to earlier Baroque designs than to a modern bridge. But there was actually quite a lot of continuity from, say, Bach's time through Mozart's time through early Beethoven, and even Schubert as far as the actual setup of the instrument. I think as late as the 1840s, there were some instruments that were still in essentially a Baroque setup, which could encompass the music of Mendelssohn, even some works of Mendelssohn. What we did see a shift in, though, funnily enough, to get back to the earlier misconception we were talking about, is a preference for Stradivari and Guarneri designs, even in so-called Baroque setup. A preference for these sorts of designs over the higher arched Amati and Steiner. Playing as I do on both designs, one thing about this Guarneri design is that it can take a lot. You still have to approach it in a way that's appropriate to a Baroque setup and gut strings, but whether it's a lot of input in terms of rapidity of notes or asking a lot in terms of chords and polyphony, the Guarneri design, which this fiddle is, can absorb a lot of that without feeling unstable. And I think as composers start to place higher and higher demands on instruments, even though they're still in a setup that is generally Baroque or Baroque-ish, the Stradivari and Guarneri design started to be favored because I think that they could absorb a high degree of input. So that is one change that we see happening even before violins became modernized wholesale. Another thing that we see happening in the early 19th century is people wanting, well, in the late 18th century too, but especially into the early 19th century, is people wanting more and more tension on the instrument for more and more brilliance. Louis Spohr was famous for using, or at least experimenting, with an A string on the E string. So a string with the thickness of an A string, a gut A string, on the E string, in order to have to put that much more tension on the instrument. So the funny thing is that Paganini, actually, the thicknesses that I mentioned that I use on this violin, which I think are appropriate to the Baroque period, are also what Paganini used, are also what Carl Flesch would recommend around the turn of the 20th century. So there's that continuity, but we have to see that in light of the fact that Paganini was actually famous for using thin strings. So that is to say that this thick Baroque stringing that I'm recommending would actually have been considered thin in Paganini's day in comparison with what many of his peers were using. So that was a time where people were wanting more and more tension, that then I think led to the widespread modernization of instruments, where people would take the flatter necks of Baroque instruments in Baroque setup and crank them, reset the necks to crank the tension up, right? Because by lowering that angle, you push down on the bridge and then soup up the sound post again. So that was the kind of historical impulse we can see toward that, and that's happening in kind of spread throughout several decades in the 19th century. But it's not yet so widespread that by the 1840s you would assume that every violin would necessarily be modernized. So there's that considerable wiggle room there. We'll see a considerable wiggle room like that in regards to the bow in just a minute, but there are a few things I'd like to talk about as we follow this evolution of the violin setup first. So let's jump to the the middle of the 19th century. Violins are widely being modernized. Viotti in Paris was one of the big proponents of modernization and one of the people who was doing a lot of it. But at the same time, they were still using gut strings, and that would have been the norm into the 20th century. So, the gut strings that we see on a Baroque violin would only slowly have given way to what we would consider more modern strings. So the steel E was introduced around 1910. The wound gut D, which, funnily enough, as I said, I was told to use on a Baroque violin growing up, that actually wasn't really developed until World War II. The wound gut A didn't appear until, I think, 1951, and then synthetics didn't come out until the 1970s. So you can see that when we talk about the modern violin, at least if we're including accessories in that, string types and whatnot, we're really talking about a later 20th century phenomenon, which just sheds light on the fact that this whole Baroque violin, modern violin duality is kind of a misconception. It's much more accurate to think of a spectrum of evolution between the Baroque period and really from the early Baroque through modern times, and to understand at what point in that historical chronology what the setup of the violin would have been at any given time. A couple of things I haven't yet mentioned along the way. This chin rest would have been developed, at least in primitive form, by Spohr in the early 19th century. A lot of people use a shoulder rest on the back, which came about in the early 20th century, but even that was resisted by a lot of leading players who felt that it impeded the tone or the freedom of the instrument. It's become widely used in the latter part of the 20th century. But even that its use is more recent. And even with string types, even though the E string, the steel E string, was the first of the more modern strings to be introduced around 1910, it was until the, I think, 50s or even 60s in some cases that certain German and Austrian orchestras actually had to sign a contract to use a gut E and not a steel E string. So it's interesting to think just until how recently these historical materials were being used. It's very, very interesting. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is shift gears and talk about the bow, which is also an essential part of the violin as an instrument. So here you've got the Baroque bow once again. That indication that that name is a little bit misleading, because this kind of bow would actually have been used to some extent, especially in Germany and England, into the early years of the 19th century. So when you think of early Beethoven symphonies being premiered around 1800, this kind of bow would still have been in use. Now, considerably before that time, other designs of bow started to be introduced that are largely called transitional today. I don't really like the term transitional because it implies a stepping stone between one absolute thing and another. The Baroque bow and the modern bow and all of these things in between are just merely trying to get to the modern bow. I don't think that's accurate to say that what we call transitional bows were designed to work optimally for the music that was fashionable at their time, which was evolving very quickly and differed place to place. So you'll find a lot of bows that we call, for lack of a better term, transitional. This is one. This is from about 1760 in France. I haven't actually seen another bow with exactly this design, which again just underscores how many different designs of bow were in use at this time. This one, if I tighten it just a little bit more, you can see how it has a slight convex curve, slight outward Baroque-ish curve here, but then curves inward toward a fairly substantial tip, much more substantial than a Baroque bow. So with this bow, you already have the ideal of the kind of sustain that you'll want to have a more bel canto-like singing from the instrument, but with, from a time where Baroque-ish articulation was still desired. So this bow does Baroque articulation in the lower half wonderfully, while affording that little bit more sustain. So this bow is from 1760. A number of other designs are from the same period. At the end of the 1700s, so the end of the 18th century, you have the modern bow designed by François Tourte. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a continuous, not all equal, but at least from beginning to end, the curve is always concave in order to distribute the weight from the frog to the tip smoothly and to get a really truly singing legato out of the bow and to produce that on the violin. It's very different than the rhetorical speech-like quality of the Baroque violin. So all that to say is, in the early, around the turn of the 19th century, all three of those bow designs would have been used, and the second, the transitional, actually encompass many different different designs. So, if you think about, again, the premiere of an early Beethoven symphony, imagine the diversity of equipment that you would have in that orchestra. And a ramification for performance practice, which we actually know from sources from the time, is that they were much less particular about unified bow strokes than, say, a modern symphony orchestra would be. There have been times in history where, even before this, certain ensembles were very concerned with unity of bowing. You think of the 24 Violons du Roi in the French court in the 17th century, right? They were known for very precise and unified bowing. By Beethoven's time and in a lot of the Romantic period, even through Richard Strauss, there was much less care that everyone was bowing in the same way. It was much more important just that players were bringing out the direction of the ensemble, the direction of the music in whatever way worked most appropriately for them. And we have a sense, especially in Beethoven's time, that they didn't rehearse much because scores and parts that survive generally don't have measure numbers. So it's very hard to start at measure 247 if you don't know where measure 247 is in your part, right? All sorts of interesting ramifications for performance practice here. All right, so we've covered quite a lot of ground already about the structure of the violin, the setup of the violin, the bow, string material, and so forth. There are two things I'd like to quickly mention because they are relevant to misconceptions about period instruments and performance practice. The first is pitch levels. To grossly oversimplify, the stereotype today is that Baroque music is performed at 415, classical repertoire is performed at 432, and 440 is modern tuning. The historical picture is actually much messier. There was chortone and kammertone, whether you were performing chamber music or church music, different places at different times, tuning at different pitch levels, ranging from Corelli's tuning in Rome to the Paris Opera, tuning at 392, which is about a whole step below modern 440A. Most tuning would have been a little higher than that. 415 is a good ballpark, but really the reason that we use 415 today is so that modern keyboard instruments can play at 440 modern tuning and then also shift to a lower tuning just by shifting the keyboard. Well, the next available note down would be a half step down. So 415 is actually very convenient for just shifting a modern keyboard down a half step. That's really why we use 415. It is a good ballpark figure, but it is just a ballpark figure. And just to illustrate how these pitch levels can be misleading, you'd think by modern historical performance practice that you'd perform, say, Handel at 415 and Mozart at 432, which is often how it's done. In reality, Handel's tuning fork was at 422, and we know that at least for some parts of his life, Mozart tuned to 422 as well. Anyway, that's just to say the picture is much more complicated than 415, 432, 440. And there are sources like Bruce Haynes, the Story of A, History of Performance Pitch, and a number of journal articles that can be really helpful in shedding light on what music in what place at what time was being performed at what pitch. So I'm not going to go into that any further here, other than to say, let's just remember that the modern norms of historical performance practice as far as tunings are general ballparks. And I should also mention, before I move on, that some tuning would have been considerably higher than 440. Bieber's A probably would have been in the late 17th century, probably would have been around 460, and others also tuning at that level too. So it is a complicated picture. Last thing that I'd almost rather not address here, but I feel I need to just because there are some misconceptions, is vibrato. Vibrato in Baroque and early music, but also as it affects the 19th century. Because the stereotype is, that I thought of growing up, Baroque music, we don't use vibrato, but then on the modern violin we do. So again, before we had cleared up what the modern violin was and when it really was in use, the question is, so at the end of the Baroque period and you play Mozart, do you suddenly just turn on the modern vibrato? And of course, even as it pertains to Baroque music, some people will say, no, you use no vibrato, and then other people will say, no, you use a modern vibrato. Gemignani says to use vibrato as often as possible. So I want to try to bring a little bit of clarity to that. Obviously, I can't go into all of the historical nuances, but suffice it to say that vibrato was certainly used during the Baroque period, but it wasn't necessarily the way we thought of the mechanism of vibrato. It was, first of all, an ornament. So Gemignani, who people like to refer to as saying vibrato should be used as often as possible, calls it the close shake. Well, it's an interesting term because close shaking is the small shake. Well, a shake is a trill. Gemignani uses the term shake to mean trill. Well, you would never recommend trilling on every note, right? You'd never say, if he said use the shake as often as possible, no one would assume that he meant to trill on every note. He'd mean that, anytime it's tasteful to use a trill, do it. Now that's not the sense in which he says that about vibrato, the close shake. But the point is the same. When he says use the close shake it should be used as often as possible to beautify notes, I think it's a foreign idea that should be used on every note. The point is that whenever you have a note that could be beautified by the addition of that tremulant feeling, bearing in mind that Leopold Mozart calls it tremolo, right? The idea is to create this quivering, tremulant feeling that can mirror the expression of the human voice or add depth and resonance to the sound. Leopold Mozart talks about it as deriving from nature herself. It's like when you strike a bell and you have this pure sound followed by the tremulant fading of the sound. So in the same way, you play a sound and have that little bit of tremolo on the end. That's generally how vibrato is understood at this period. And so when Gemignani says use it as often as possible, I think he means use that type of ornament as often as it is in good taste for beautifying notes. Leopold Mozart, on the other hand, says that some people just tremble constantly, and he says that's in very poor taste. But of course, reading between the lines, that also means that some people were doing that. Some people were, at least in his words, trembling constantly. So it was done, but I think most people probably would have found that not in good taste at the time. And for my taste, a period instrument with gut string, it just doesn't need it. If you try to use a modern, at the risk of sounding absurd, it just the way the instrument responds acoustically, it doesn't flatter it. The modern vibrato is much more suited to the particular resonances of metal wound synthetic strings, where the vibrato can help to deepen the sound and to bring out a voice-like quality that gut in some ways always provides without a huge vibrato. So again, it's a complicated topic, but I think the expectation is that vibrato is something that could be applied at will to beautify notes, like in the understanding that it was an ornament. The interesting thing is that theory of vibrato usage actually continued through the 19th century. Leopold Auer, who was Heifetz's teacher, makes some comments that are almost identical to Leopold Mozart. And it is true that in that time, vibrato usage might have changed, and there might have, the way Leopold Mozart used vibrato might not have been the same exactly as Leopold Auer. But I don't even think that it was necessarily a straight line. I think there was some ebb and flow and just changes in practice. And one source in Mendelssohn's time actually describes vibrato as obsolete. Very interesting, right? But in our earliest recordings of celebrated violinists, Joachim recorded a few pieces at the very beginning of the 20th century, and you hear a tone that is basically pure, but he gives it this little bit of voltage passing through the middle of a note. But not on every note. So even there, it wasn't constant, but the microphone is hearing that tremble up close. But in a big hall, I'm sure that the effect that he was wanting people to hear is of just simply a pure sound, and that little electricity, as a soloist himself, was to help the sound come up and fill a hall and be heard in some cases over an orchestra. But I think that pure sound ideal is still very much exemplified by Joachim, whom Brahms wrote his violin concerto for. So that brings us to the advent of the 20th century and all of the confluences of factors that led to not only modern vibrato, but modern performance practice as we know it. And that's much too complex for us to get into just at this moment. So I think we'll leave it there for today, but I hope it's been helpful to have this kind of brief overview of some misconceptions of historical violin design, bow construction, string material, and all of these things that can have really pretty serious ramifications for our performance practice. Because I think if we look within the parameters that history does present, we'll find some really interesting avenues for exploration. And I think in some ways we're only really just tapping into those. I think the next few decades are going to have a lot of exciting developments, not only in terms of scholarship, but in terms of the musical insights that performers can bring within these historical parameters. So I'm excited very much to see where things go, and I hope you all can take part in that. I think it's an exciting time for making early music part of a really a living part of our musical culture. And I think we're moving very much in that direction, and I'm just excited to see that continue. So, as always, happy music making.